Grüezi from Vienna, Austria. Welcome to Classical Cake, the podcast where we discuss topics relating to Viennese classical music while enjoying one of Vienna's delicious cakes. I'm your host, Daniel Adam Maltz. Today we will solve the mystery behind one of classical music history's most famous love stories, the identity of Beethoven's immortal beloved. My guest is Dr. Rita Stäblin, a musicologist whose archival work combines music history, iconography, and genealogical research. Dr. Stäblin, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Today's cake is a Schoko-Mousse Herz, or chocolate mousse heart. This treat has a thin base of chocolate sponge cake and a chocolate mousse filling. It is completely coated in dark chocolate and is decorated with gold leaf. All of this is cut, appropriately, in the shape of a heart. Let's dig in. The famously temperamental Beethoven never married. But between July 6th and 7th in 1812, Beethoven wrote a three-part letter. In it, he writes of his unconditional love and devotion to someone he refers to as his unsterbliche Geliebte, or immortal beloved. He never sent this letter. The letter was discovered after Beethoven's death and naturally sparked intense curiosity about what woman inspired such passion. Researchers have been divided as to whom the intended recipient was. Many times it's fostered a heated debate. Finding the answer required cross-referencing 200-year-old letters, diaries, memoirs, as well as other documents to find clues. It also required challenging previously accepted scholarship, approaching the subject from new angles to find the truth. But through dedication, Dr. Stäblin finally solved this mystery. Dr. Stäblin, why has the idea of Beethoven's immortal beloved captured imaginations for almost 200 years?
Well, the letter itself is one of the most passionate letters that anyone has ever written, and certainly the most passionate by a composer. And because there's a mystery behind it, people wanted to solve the mystery, and each generation has had a go at it, and yeah.
People love a story, right? They want to feel like they're a part of it. What motivated your search for Beethoven's immortal beloved?
When I was a piano teacher in Vancouver for 7 years, I read the book by Marie Elizabeth Tellenbach on Josefina Brunswick as the immortal beloved. And that convinced me that she had the right woman. And I mean, I can't say that I was the first to come up with Josefina. In fact, it was an earlier woman who actually, in my mind, solved the mystery. And this was Lamara. She was in her 80s in 1920 when she brought out the book, but she was already in her 80s and died soon after, and so that's where it remained. I mean, because her solution was never taken seriously. And I should go back and explain that this letter was found in Beethoven's estate along with the Heiligenstadt Testament. And it ended up in Schindler's possession. How? I mean, And Schindler brought out the first official biography of Beethoven in 1840. And there he claimed that the letter was mentioned Julie Guicciardi. She was the dedicatee of the Moonlight Sonata. And it wasn't until 1860 when he brought out another edition of his Beethoven biography with a facsimile of the letter that people could see, well, Julie isn't even mentioned in Beethoven's letter. So it was just made up by Schindler.
So as we mentioned, Josefina Brunswick as the immortal beloved. What do we know about Josefina, and why would Beethoven have been so enraptured by her?
Josefina came to Vienna in May of 1799 with her mother and her older sister Teresa to have piano lessons with Beethoven.
Okay.
And Teresa explains all of this in her memoirs in great detail, and how Beethoven was so taken with the musicality and, I guess, with the beauty of Josefina, that instead of just 1 hour a day, he would teach them for 4 hours a day. And they also went on picnics and outings and to fortepiano workshops, and Beethoven recommended a Walter piano and so on. And so he was with them for this whole time. But Josefina's mother was looking for a husband for her daughters. And the older one, Teresa, well, she sort of had a bit of a crooked back and wasn't that attractive. So Josefina was very charming, very beautiful. And on one of their outings, they went to the wax museum of Count Dame, Joseph Dame. And he later said that as soon as he saw Josefina, he said, "She is going to be my wife."
So this speaks to Josefina's sort of magnetic
Yeah,
appeal.
exactly. I think she had this attraction that the men just fell for her. It wasn't just her husband Dame. And what I am bringing out now are the 108 marriage letters between Dame and Josefina.
You mentioned these in the-
And they're very erotic, and they show, that it was really a loving marriage, not like what you read in Theresa's memoirs.
Let's get to the evidence you discovered. You presented some interesting similarities between letters known to be written by Beethoven to Josefina and the Immortal Beloved letter.
After the Second World War, the communists came into the Czech Republic, and descendants of Josefina, of her son Fritz, they fled. And they took with them 14 letters that they had in Beethoven's hand. And these are love letters from Beethoven to Josefina that he wrote between about 1804 and, say, 1809. This was the period after Dame had died. Josefina was a widow with 4 young children, and Beethoven gave concerts in her house. She was now running this museum and continued to give her lessons. And so you have these letters that turned up, and the language is very close to what Beethoven used in the letter to the Immortal Beloved.
Yeah.
He calls her my angel, my all.
Yeah.
And he talks about his love for her, and that he's won her heart, and that it will make him more productive in his compositions, and that she knows he's faithful to her, and no other woman can win his heart. And so you have the same sort of wording in these earlier love letters and the letter to the Immortal Beloved, where he says, "You know I have been faithful to you, that no other woman can."
So to clarify for those who don't speak German, please explain the significance of Beethoven referring to Josefina as du instead of the formal sie.
Yeah, it's like the French too. Beethoven very rarely used du. And to use du with a woman,
Especially
It was-
a married woman, I imagine.
yes, it would have meant that there had been an intimate love relationship.
So, as you mentioned, Dame had died in 1804. And so Beethoven now is writing letters to the widowed Josefina
Right.
from Brunswick. And when did Josefina marry Stackelberg?
What you get in these 14 love letters, and there are also drafts of her replies, you see that towards the end, around 1807, Josefina didn't allow Beethoven into her house anymore.
Yeah.
And I had found a letter from Charlotte, the youngest sister, who had just gotten married, and this is in 1807, where she's warning Josefina, don't be alone with Beethoven. Don't let him into your house. Let God return peace to your soul, and so that you can return to your children and your family.
Which is, of course, very similar to the Immortal Beloved letter in the way that Beethoven says you're hiding yourself.
Exactly, he says, and don't hide yourself from me. So what other woman meets
Right.
that? I mean,
Excellent.
and so you have this case where she did not allow him into her house and hid herself from him. So In 1808, Josefina, Teresa, and the two little boys, Fritz and Karl, went on a long journey and ended up in Switzerland. And it was there that they met Stackelberg, who was an Estonian baron. And I discovered that Josefina got pregnant, and her fifth child was illegitimate, Maria Laura. And so she was, in a sense, forced to marry this baron. And so the marriage took place in Gran, Esztergom, Hungary, in February of 1810. I just recently discovered another letter by Teresa to Josefina with the proof that they were hiding Maria Laura for about 3 years. And I also found another letter from Teresa to Josefina. This is much later, where she's recommending that they go for a holiday together. And she says, we could go to Naples, we could go to Brazil, or we could go to England with Beethoven. And this is dated 1818. Oh, wow. And all the people, all these scholars in the States and in England and Germany who claim that Josefina cannot be the immortal beloved, they're all saying there's no proof that there was any contact between Josefina and Beethoven later on. Well, here you have 1818.
So let's move forward. It's believed that Beethoven had a surprise encounter with his immortal beloved in Prague on July 3rd, 1812, just 3 days before the immortal beloved letter is written. What is the evidence that this encounter took place, and what clues place Josefina in Prague at this time?
We know from Teresa Brunswick's memoirs that there was a serious fight between Josefina and her second husband Stackelberg in June of 1812, and that Stackelberg got really angry and left. And so Josefina was left alone, and there were great financial problems. And we know, in fact, I found documents in Brno, that Stackelberg had made a quick trip to Prague in 1811 to borrow money from a banker there. And this money was now due, and well, Stackelberg had left Josefina, and so she had a wagon with horses. She had many relatives from her first husband in Prague. And after Dame's death, she took all her 4 children to speak with the Emperor Franz. And he said, don't worry, your children are my children. Well, the Emperor was in Prague on July 1st. And so I think that she wanted to try to solve this financial problems by speaking with the emperor and speaking with relatives of her husband. And then working on her papers in Jindřichův Hradec, I found some diaries, not really chronological, but some of the entries are June 1812. And one of the entries says, I want to speak to Liebert in Prague. And we also know from her sister Teresa's memoirs that Josefina had made a plan for 1812. Teresa was supposed to take care of the older children in a villa in the suburbs of Vienna, and Josefina wanted to go again to Karlsbad. And so Teresa certainly spent the summer of 1812 taking care of the children in a villa in Hacking, and so where was Josefina? And we know that Beethoven met unexpectedly someone in Prague, because in a letter later to Varnhagen van Ense, he apologizes for not having kept an appointment that he had made on the evening of July the 3rd. And so when the letter to the immortal beloved dated July 6th, and it only mentions the trip between Prague and Teplitz, where Beethoven was writing this letter. So in other words, he must have met this woman in Prague on the 3rd, because that's when he didn't keep his appointment.
So, up to this point, we've discussed Beethoven longing after Josefina for years, a surprise encounter where they spent the night together in Prague, and the Immortal Beloved letter that Beethoven never sent, where he pleaded for Josefina to find a way for them to be together. Then there comes an entry in Beethoven's diary that ends, Auf diese Art mit A geht alles zugrunde. This means, in this manner with the initial A, everything goes to ruin. Besides clearly stating that there was not a happy ending to this affair, many researchers also said that if the Immortal Beloved were Josefina, that the diary entry would have to read, in this manner with J, everything goes to ruin. In fact, there's been a lot of confusion surrounding this initial A.
Beethoven wrote this entry in a diary that he started in the fall of 1812. It's actually the first entry. And because of this letter that looked like A in the first copy, because Beethoven's diary is actually missing, and we only have 2 copies. And a lot of scholars in the 20th century claimed that this letter A referred to the Immortal Beloved. And so they were looking for a woman whose first name started with A. So that's where you get Antony Brentano or Almarie Esterhazy or Amalia Sebald and so on. And I like to look at old problems from a new angle. And so I thought, well, auf diese Art mit A geht alles zugrunde. Why should the letter A refer to the woman? The problem person would be her husband. He's the one that's causing all the problems for Beethoven. And because I did so much work on papers in the archives, especially Jindřichův Hradec, where you have all the papers that were sent to Josefina, I noticed that her husband, Stackelberg, always referred to with just ST, that the ST, I used to misread it as an A. And then that gave me the idea, hey, this might not be A. This might have been a mistake by the copyist. And it really was, auf diese Art mit Stackelberg, everything is going to ruin.
And so you, in doing your research into this theory, found examples in Beethoven's hand where he writes both an A and an ST in Beethoven's hand, so that we have definitive proof. And you found something curious about his ST.
His ST looks very much like an A. And Greffer, who was the copyist, if he just saw this one initial cipher, well, because ST is kind of unusual.
Right.
And A is much more common, so he just copied it as an A, but I think it really was ST.
It sends people down the wrong track
Yeah.
for hundreds of years. Yeah. If we're skipping forward now, there is another cryptic comment that has stumped Beethoven researchers for years. It comes from Fanny Giantasio del Rio in September of 1816, when she wrote down a snippet of a conversation she overheard between Beethoven and her father on a walk in Baden. What is your view about this?
Yes, I mean, her comment was that she'd overheard Beethoven's, her father had asked Beethoven, had he never met a woman that he would want to marry? And Beethoven had said yes, 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. He had gotten to know, he used the word kennen, gotten to know a woman. Well, we know that Beethoven knew Josefina since 1799, so 5 years before would disqualify her. But I decided to look at the problem again from a new angle and to look at that word kennen and thought, okay, if you view it in the biblical sense of to know a woman, sleep with her, then it fits Josefina.
And so your theory, you're saying that Fanny Giantasio del Rio is simply substituting the other German verb kennenlernen, which is just to get to know somebody.
Well, she does admit that she was at some distance and was trying to listen in onto this conversation. And she found on Beethoven's desk something that said, my heart overflows at the sight of beautiful nature, although without her. In other words, he must have been walking in nature in Baden with his beloved earlier.
It would seem to suggest that 4 years later it was still and has only ever been this one woman. You presented evidence that places Josefina in Baden around this time as well.
Yes, first of all, there are the memoirs of her oldest son, Fritz, who he started writing when he was 20 years old to his 15-year-old bride. And he talks about how they had a wonderful summer, 1816, in Baden. And Marie Elizabeth Tellenbach had already found in the spa lists Josefina's entry later that summer. But knowing Fritz had said end of April that they'd already gone to Baden, there I found in an earlier list, Josephine, I should say, had been hiding under a assumed name, Meyersfeld, but it was hyphenated, Dame Meyersfeld, there it was. And yeah, now we have proof that Josefina was in Baden for weeks.
Right. So this is where the story gets particularly interesting to me, and I think to anybody who has an interest in this subject, is that there is more to this encounter on July 3rd in Prague in 1812 that Beethoven had with Josefina. In fact, you give evidence that Josefina gave birth to Beethoven's child. So why, given this, would she have returned to her husband?
Well, what a scandal. I know that in 1811, a year before the Immortal Beloved letter, she was not sleeping with her husband anymore because there are letters where she instructed the setup of their bedrooms when she was going to go to that estate in Moravia that they'd bought. And she even wanted a maid sleeping between the two bedrooms. So all of a sudden, after this night with Beethoven, she probably suspects, what do I do if I am pregnant? Because she was so fertile. All of her other earlier 6 children were conceived immediately after she'd slept with her first husband and then her second husband. And so I think what happened is that instead of going on to Karlsbad, as she had originally planned, and that's why in Beethoven's letter you have that statement, we will probably see each other in K. Yeah. But no, I think that she then sent him a letter saying, I have to change my plans, I'm going back to Vienna. And so that's why he never sent the letter. And so what did she have to do but try to fix her marriage? And and I think from the memoirs of her son Fritz, you see what efforts she went to be the loving wife. She even applied for a pass to go to Italy with him and the children and so on. And then exactly 9 months after the letter to the Immortal Beloved, you have her 7th child born, Minona.
And this would explain how in the fall, Beethoven, returning to Vienna, sees a happily married Josefina with Stackelberg and writes, Auf diese Grund mit ST geht alles zugrunde. That's right.
And there's some other passages in his diary where around the birth of Minona, where he says, I will have to leave Vienna. Why? Maybe he thought there'd be this scandal about the paternity, or he wanted to undertake a große Handlung, something, and I think that was to declare his paternity, but instead he didn't want to cause a scandal for Josefina. And so it's exactly at that point that he lays claim to his nephew Karl, even though Karl's father was still alive and wouldn't die for another few years. But because Beethoven couldn't lay claim to his own child, he then took over this nephew. And so there were deep psychological reasons for him doing that.
Yeah. What do we know about Minona?
Yes, well, the name comes from Ossian, that Gaelic bard who and appears in Goethe's Sorrows of Werther, and is the daughter of a musician. And the names that Josefina gave to her children all have symbolic meaning, and I think this name, Minona, as the daughter of a musician, is of significance. And Teresa, in her memoirs, talks about Minona as being different from the other children, being very strong in her personality, so much that we called her the governess. And she also showed the most genius among the children. And what I'm doing right now is to search further in the papers of the Brunswick family for letters that Minona herself wrote or comments about her. And what I have found is that she was musical and that they were hoping that she could make a living as a musician.
Right, and there's this snippet from the conversation book, was it 1819 or 1820, I believe, where somebody writes to Beethoven about this musical child.
This was about the time when Stackelberg brought his 3 daughters, including this Minona, back to Vienna. And Teresa says Minona was 6 years old. So this was late 1819. And exactly at that point in Beethoven's conversation book, someone is asking him and writing out, "You talk so much about the woman that her husband is going to suspect that the child among his children that has musical talent is your child." I mean, this is great
really.
proof.
You mentioned in one of your articles that Minona is buried in Vienna's Central Cemetery. Beethoven is buried there as well, of course. What are your thoughts about a DNA test?
Years ago, a Berlin film crew wanted to make a film with me holding a shovel at her grave. And I had heard that the gravesite was up for sale, and of course, what would happen to the bones? It'd be gone forever. So I contacted the health agency, the Gesundheitsamt, and they're responsible for gravesites, and found out what I could. And just recently, the business manager of the Beethoven House in Bonn, Malte Bürker, wanted to have all of my correspondence with this Gesundheitsamt. Oh, yeah, because in the end, it was sort of like, well, who's going to pay for this? I mean, I can't afford to pay to have her bones, her remains exhumed. And then they said, pietätlos, there's no piety, because you'd have to exhume Beethoven as well to make a study. And then other people told me it's not possible to determine fatherhood from such old bones. But Malte Bürker, the business head at the Beethoven House in Bonn, wrote me just recently an email saying, I'd like to let you know that I have secured Minona's grave site and nothing will happen to her bones. And what I've been doing recently is watching all these YouTube stories, where do I come from, and these DNA studies. Well, if 50% of Minona's bones come from Estonia, well, then Stackelberg is the father. But if 50% come from Bonn, well, then that would prove it. So who knows? I mean, DNA studies are improving. As I say, you can't, at this point, determine fatherhood, but maybe there are other ways.
Yeah. We'll have to see. Dr. Stäblen, I would like to thank you personally for your research. Beethoven is the reason why I fell in love with music, and your research sheds light on a side of Beethoven that is quite opposite to the fiery personality we often think of, a Beethoven who wanted to love and be loved. So thank you for joining me today.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to request podcast topics relating to Viennese classicism, please contact me through my website, danieladamaltz.com. You can also sign up for my monthly newsletter that compiles all the content for that month. I'm Daniel Adam Maltz. Auf Wiedersehen.